Hello, and welcome to another episode of the Profit Minds podcast. I'm your host, Dr. Stephen Kirch, creator of the Profit Minds Growth System, a unique blend of profit growth, productivity acceleration, and building robust business process for scale. In every episode, I interview entrepreneurs and small business owners from around the world with a unique story to tell. You can find the show on YouTube, LinkedIn, Apple and Google Podcasts, Stitcher, Spotify, and more. Hi, everyone. Today, my guest is Ruth Rathblott, inspirational speaker, best-selling author, and former nonprofit CEO. And today, we're going to be talking about hiding and learning how to unhide. Welcome, Ruth.
Hi, Steve. I'm excited to be here and having this conversation with you.
Yeah, thanks. Thanks for coming. So, the first question I ask everybody is, how did you get here? What's your story?
Yes, it is. I won't take you all the way back, but I'll definitely take you to a point of how I got even here today, which is for 25 years, Steve, I was a nonprofit leader that was focused on providing opportunities, both education opportunities, mentoring opportunities, career opportunities for young people. And I really thought that's where I would always have a career. Like that would be my birth and my death, my retirement. And at one point, I was in a conversation about diversity and leadership in an organization I was running. And I asked a really naive question, Steve. I asked the question, do you see me as diverse? And I'm not sure what answer I expected back, but the answer I got was, well, I guess you're a woman, so that counts as diversity. And I said, yep, sure enough, let's check the box that gender does count, because often when we talk about diversity, we talk about race and we talk about gender and maybe sexual orientation, which are critical pillars. I got my undergrad in psychology and my graduate degree in social work and understood what cultural competency looked like and understood lenses of diversity. And when I followed up on that question of, do you see me as diverse, and asked about my disability, because Steve, I was born with a limb difference. I was born missing my left hand. I asked, what about my disability? And as part of diversity. And the answer back to that was, oh, we don't see you like that. And I wasn't really asking to be seen as anything. I was asking for it to be acknowledged as a part of the conversation on diversity and inclusion. And when I started reaching out to my corporate partners, where I'd done a lot of fundraising for nonprofits over those 25 years, I started to ask them, how were they talking about DEI? How was disability showing up in those conversations? And I was finding it wasn't totally showing up. I had been on DEI panels. I had attended DEI panels. And so one of my companies invited me in to share my story. And I have to tell you, Steve, I wasn't sure I had a story because, again, I had been this nonprofit leader for 25 years. And my contact smartly said, share your story about your hiding, that you hid part of yourself for 25 years. You hid your limb difference. And sure enough, I went in and I talked about the idea of expanding the conversation on diversity to include disability. And I also shared my story of hiding my hand for 25 years, starting at the age of 13. And what's amazing, Steve, is afterward, people came up and said two things. Thank you so much for including disability, both the visible, like yours, and the non-apparent, like mental health and neurodiversity, as part of the conversation. And the second thing that probably resonated even more with people and has ever since, as I talk at different companies throughout the globe, is this idea of hiding, and that most of us, Steve, are hiding something about ourselves. How do we learn to unhide?
Yeah, that's fascinating. From a couple of aspects for me, as a white male, right? Not diverse, but with the neurodivergent brain, as I've come to learn, squirrel,
Mm.
my ADHD, which is a gift in a lot of ways. But I have a daughter that teaches writing at Columbia, and she's very, very much in tune with the neurodivergent world. She actually has a writing cohort for writers with ADHD.
Wow. Wow. No, and
And
sorry, go ahead. No, I think that you're touching on something, both the neurodiversity part that I hear, right? And also the white male piece, because I think sometimes we've left white men out of the inclusion conversation. And the hiding part is relevant there because there's a statistic that 45% of white men hide in the workplace. They hide their mental health, their PTSD. And so I think, and I actually think that number is higher.
Probably. Well, because they're all hidden.
And
then some of us don't even want to admit it.
No, that's part of hiding. That's part of, I think there's a lot of, I'm working on my second book right now. And a piece of that is it's about the 4 archetypes of hiding and what that looks like.
So let's dig into this hiding thing a little bit, since that's about your first book, right? Learning to unhide. So talk a little bit about hiding. What does that look like?
Hiding is deliberately not sharing a part of yourself for fear of rejection, for fear of judgment, a fear of retaliation. So it's that idea that if I share this part of myself, if someone finds out, they won't accept me. And so it's better to just keep it to myself. My first book, single-handedly, was about my journey of hiding my hand, hiding my limb difference, and really with the idea that I wanted to be seen, Steve, as somebody who had 2 hands in the world, somebody who didn't look different, because we often think about our cultural norms that we put out there, right? What is beauty? What is smart? What is successful? And if you don't match up to that, you start to hide those parts of yourself because you think, I don't want anyone to know. And it's exhausting. It's lonely. And what I've come to find since writing my first book and doing research and more writing is the idea that it's actually universal, that most of us are hiding something. And so that hiding it takes a toll.
Yeah. And in fact, I might argue that everybody hides something.
Yes.
And it may or may not be something that, our culture would call for you to hide, but it's something perhaps that you're ashamed of, perhaps that, whether it's a behavior or an aspect of yourself, or, there's lots of different, I love this. There's lots of different pieces that we hide. I hide when I make a mistake because I'm a perfectionist.
Yes.
And I don't like people to see me as anything other than perfect.
Right. Because either there's an internal dialogue that you play, right? About
sure.
And there's also an external message that you got at some point along your journey that this is what that's what it may look like to make that somebody was successful if they were a perfectionist, right? Or there was a control piece to it, a certainty piece to it. So yeah, absolutely. No, I've had people share with me, Steve, when I get on a plane, I like to talk to the person next to me. I'm not one of those.
That shocks me.
I know. It could shock you. It doesn't. No. It is. And I talk about, right, we get to the point of a conversation where each person says what they do for a living. And I was sitting on a plane a few months ago, and the man next to me talked about, he was a graphic design owner. He owned a graphic design business. And I shared that I talk about and I work with leaders around the idea of how do they engage and transform their cultures so that their employees can unhide and thrive and belong. Because when we hide, it holds us back.
Sure.
And immediately, Steve, his head went down and he said, I know exactly what you're talking about. I hide. And I said, what do you hide? And he said, I didn't go to college. And he said, and I never share that with anyone because I'm so afraid that if someone finds out, they'll think I'm not smart enough. They'll think I'm not a good business person. And yet I have this successful graphic design business. He said, Ruth, every time that conversation comes up, I want to leave the room. I look for the exit. That's an exhausting way of being, Steve.
Oh, gosh.
But it happens all the time, to your point. People hide in such different ways. And yet we expect to want to really connect with people, especially right now, given this loneliness epidemic that we're in. How do we connect with people when we're hiding parts of ourselves?
So let's talk about the flip side. What does it mean to unhide? How do you do that? How do you make the first step?
Oh, that's a good question. So unhiding, I equate it to, Steve, and I imagine your listeners, if you hold your breath, right? If you take a deep breath in and you hold it for, let's just even say 10 seconds, there's that tension, right? And when you finally exhale, it's a release, right? It's a relief. That's what unhiding feels like. It allows for that space to say, wow, I can actually just be myself. I can let down my guard. I see people exhale when they unhide to me, and for their shoulders to drop, to release. It's that unhiding is that sharing of part of yourself, so that people can get to know you, also because about connection. And the first step starts with acknowledging what it is that you're hiding. What is it that you're hiding that's holding you back from connecting with others? What's holding you back from that career decision that you want to make? What's the story that you've told yourself? And I have to tell you, Steve, sometimes we're not the most reliable narrators of our stories, right? And so the first step becomes sitting down and saying, what is it that I'm hiding? And there's actually 4 steps to this unhiding journey. But the first is, it starts with you. It starts with that space of, what is it that I'm hiding? What's holding me back?
Yeah. And I can resonate with that, with that release, that breath, that exhale, the relaxation that comes with, because there are people who know, right? And think, I'll encourage the listeners to think about those people who know the real you.
Mm-hmm.
How does it feel to be different and be a room full of people like that versus people that you're afraid to share that with? I think that to me would be a huge just self-differentiator, right? Of when am I hiding, when am I not, and recognizing that.
And what it allows, Steve, is when we do unhide to someone, so you sharing what you just shared about something that you hide allows me to say, wow, you're not perfect, right? Quote unquote. I can now share with you something that's quote unquote not perfect about me, so that we actually let down some guard and don't have to be impressing not only ourselves, but other people. We can actually just have connection. That's what true connection is about, is this idea of, how do we just be our best self? How do we just get to be ourselves?
Yeah. That's really interesting. So the first step is recognize that, yes, you're hiding something, and maybe a sense of what that is. So what are the other 3 steps?
Yep. So the second step is what you just alluded to, which is somebody else, inviting someone else in. It's just one person. And Steve,
Okay.
Your point around your listeners, it's after you've thought about what it is that you're hiding and you've gotten to that space of pausing and thinking about it, then think about that one person. And often it's a go-to person, right? That trusted person in your life that you can be yourself with, to say, hey, I just heard this podcast. This woman talked about that she was hiding for 25 years. Steve shared something that he has as part of his hiding. I thought about it myself, and just invite in that one other person, because that's where it starts. And so after you've acknowledged and invited that person in, then the third step becomes building your community, building that shared experience of others who may be hiding the same things that you are, or similar things, so that you know you're not alone. I went through the majority of my life, Steve, thinking I was the only one that had a limb difference, because I didn't want to see other limb differences or disabilities.
Because if you acknowledge it in somebody else, you have to acknowledge it in yourself, right?
And you have to reframe and rewire some of those messages that you've given. But you also then, you have to deal with it. And I actually also thought I invented hiding. It sounds a little bit vain, but I thought I was the only one hiding too. So when I started to find a community of people with limb differences like mine, I realized, first of all, I wasn't alone. And second, I didn't invent hiding. It was a coping strategy of feeling different. It was coping around feeling insecure. And then, so the third step is building that community. And then, Steve, the fourth step, which I think is, each step is powerful and each step has a pause after it because you want to create space so that someone can react to it. Someone can, how are you taking in that information? And then but the fourth step is what I think is why I go on podcasts and I speak around the globe. It's sharing out your story, because the power of sharing your story allows for someone else, just like we're doing here, to see themselves in us and to say, wow, I've hidden part of myself too. Like, I'm not alone. And that's the power of the shared story. So it's acknowledging what you're hiding, inviting someone in, that go-to person, building your community, and then sharing out your story. And it becomes this amazing loop or almost flywheel that allows for someone else to start on their journey of unhiding.
Yeah. So the other thing is, I'm guessing that people hide more than one thing.
Yes. Yes.
So how do you, I presume it's okay to unhide one thing at a time so that you don't feel like you've got to go, complete open kimono all at once, right? That just a baby step.
One step at a time.
Yeah.
And the truth is that unhiding and hiding are a continuum. It is not a flip of a switch that all of a sudden one of your listeners is going to all of a sudden wake up and be like, oh, tomorrow I'm going to unhide, because it's unpacking and undoing a lot of the stories again, or the messages that we've gotten. And I also want to recognize that there is privilege in unhiding, because there are certain groups, Steve, that you and I both know where it can feel really unsafe to unhide. And it is unsafe to unhide. So it's making sure there's a conscious effort and agency about choice. When do you unhide? When is it safe? When is it trusting? When are you sharing it with somebody who has empathy? It's a journey. This unhiding is absolutely a continuum, and it's a journey, and it's not a flip of a switch. So it's not, you don't just wake up and say, I'm going to unhide. It is, there's really great resources in terms of therapy, in terms of, I did a lot of journaling, just using that space. And yes, people can be hiding more than one thing. Most of us are.
Yeah. And I think it's important to recognize the cultural context under which unhiding is safe.
Right.
Because we don't want to encourage people to do things we do this as human beings as a coping mechanism, because our need to belong to community is so ingrained in the way our brain operates.
Absolutely. And that's why that third step is so critical, is building out your community, building out that support system. And I don't advocate for someone going on a podcast for the fourth step to share their story or doing it in a way that I do it. It can just be with a few people, because it allows that space for the shared experience, for that somebody else to help and be guided by this. But yes, no, I think about the trans community, for example. So there are spaces, unfortunately, still in 2024, where it is unsafe to be out. So how do you find your community? How do you build others who may be going through that same journey with you? How do you create, again, not to make it unsafe, because that's not the goal here. The goal is continued safety, psychological safety, and actual safety as well.
Yeah. And I think, just in terms of the trans community, because there are members of my family who are trans, and recognizing the importance of that first person that you come out to, and the criticality of family support.
Yes.
Particularly for trans individuals, the suicide rate for trans folks is huge. And the number one statistic that overcomes that is family support.
Yeah. And so that you bring up such a great point, Steve, because I think there's two pieces to what you just said. One is being very mindful of who that person that you come out to is too, right? To who you unhide. I have a checklist that I often share with people, which is it's someone who has empathy. It's someone who's a good listener. It's someone who is curious. It's someone that you trust, right? That because those, and I'm sure your listeners can add to that checklist of who are those, what are those qualities of the person? And the second piece that you're talking about too is the power of the pause, because sometimes when we share and unhide to someone part of ourselves, they may not know how to react right away, right? That they may not have all of the skill sets or I mean, I know when I told people about my hand, when I started unhiding, it was a very clumsy process for me. And I would blurt it out. Steve, I'd say, oh, I don't have a hand. And then I would expect it either to be accepted or to be rejected. There was no room for the gray. And what I've learned is that gray area, that power of that pause allows for someone to be able to ask questions and to sit with it if they haven't seen this before or they haven't heard this before, right? That's the critical part. And for us as the person who's delivering it, to recognize it's not rejection if someone needs a minute, right? It's okay. It's allowing for that.
And to allow for the gray as well, allow for the, I'm not sure how I'm reacting to this, right? I still care about you as an individual, but this is a different, now we have a different relationship.
In both personal interactions like that, and I would argue for professional relationships too, right? Absolutely. In the workplace, how do leaders and similarly, how do employees handle information, and how do we give space for that pause? Because that power of the pause is critical, and the gray is critical.
Yeah, and I think you make a really, really excellent point that when you're sharing this, to be mindful of the potential impact that this could have on the person you're sharing it with.
Yes.
And it may, in some cases, do damage to the relationship, right? It may not come across the way you want it to, right? Again, hopefully you've done this enough times, that you have a community of support and that you're not devastated. And again, I think that's part of the problem with the trans community when the first person you share it with says, well, what you're doing is wrong or who you are is wrong. That sends folks into the suicide.
Yeah, that rejection piece is really hard. That's why that second step of inviting someone in becomes, again, critical, because it's the idea of really thinking about who is going to be there. And sometimes people will disappoint you. That's the hardest part. It doesn't mean to give up, though, by sharing out a part of yourself and just keeping it hidden, because that's not the goal. That, again, it is exhausting and it is lonely to hide. And how do we create that community and connection, that sense of belonging that you pointed out that we're all looking for?
Yeah. And that's what I love about, when I, more than 15 years ago, I was teaching a class on we called it micro inequities at Intel. But it was on diversity, equity, and inclusion. And recognizing that it's not a checklist item. Right. No. Diversity is not a checklist item. You have to include. But I love the newer version of this that includes belonging, DEIB, and the recognition that not only do you need to, yes, recognize that there's diversity, recognize that everybody should have an equal voice, independent of their diverse position, that they're included in that, but that they also feel like they belong.
Well, and it starts with leadership, Steve, because it's about the idea of that leaders go first. And in my equation, leaders go first when they unhide, so that they set the culture. Because to your point, and we could I know we're, in terms of time, I'm just mindful, but I'm also thinking of diversity is such a big topic, right? But the truth is, what it boils down to for me, and where I've shared my angle, is how do we value different experiences and different perspectives? Because that true diversity to me, is when we start to realize that we all bring something to the table. There's enough room at the table for all of us to be seen and be heard and belong. So how do we create that space?
And that's what makes DEIB such a net positive for the company, because those diversity of perspectives and opinions and thought patterns is what creates the greater whole.
Well, and it's what contributes to retention numbers. It's what contributes to engagement. And at the end of the day, it's what creates innovation and creativity when you can bring that forward.
And results. Yeah.
And results. Yeah. Bottom line.
And it is all about the bottom line. And it really does matter.
It really does matter. Yeah, absolutely. And unhiding is a solution to that, because hiding is a problem in companies. People feel that they're not seen and heard and don't belong. And so unhiding becomes that solution, and leaders go first in it to create the culture.
So Ruth, if somebody wanted to reach out to you, what's the best way for them to do that?
Steve, I think there's two big ways. One is I'm on LinkedIn. I'm very active on LinkedIn. So Ruth Rathblott. And then the other is my website. Through my website, people can connect with me. I have a lot of information about the work that I do on there, my books and my TEDx talks. So that's where people can find me.
Great. Yeah, and that concludes our show. Thanks so much to my guest, Ruth Rathblott, an inspirational speaker, best-selling author, and former nonprofit CEO. I hope you learned something today about how to unhide. I know I did. Thanks for listening. You've been listening to the Profit Minds podcast. This is your host, Dr. Stephen Kirch. Please visit www.profitminds.net for other episodes or to contact me. Thank you for your positive feedback, comments, questions, and for sharing this show with others. Thanks for listening. Have a grateful day.